let's talk about the first 100 days. Obviously, very boring and uneventful. We had a Supreme Court pick confirmed. We have, healthcare reform. The repeal of the Affordable Care Act doesn't seem to be going anywhere. The travel ban has been blocked twice. How are we to concretely assess Donald Trump's first 100 days in office?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess it's so.
I'm gunning for Brian's job, so.
Yeah, I know. That's stumping me with these difficult questions. I think the way that, there's different ways you could look at, right? You could look historically, you could look sort of as a voter looking at it. I think from my perspective in the media, what has struck me about the first 100 days is how busy and chaotic it has felt, but then to look back at the end of the 100 days and see so little accomplished, like you're saying, Obamacare.
Still here.
Basically,
Still
yeah.
here.
The Obamacare repeal died. Even this sort of recent push looks, pretty grim for the Republican Party. You're looking at all of Donald Trump's, if you look at he basically put out a 30-point plan, right? Mm-hmm. He said, this is what I'm going to do in the first 100 days. He delivered on 3. And, one of them was appointing a Supreme Court justice, which, fair enough, but that's not really that's not a bold achievement that requires, a complete control of Washington by one party. So I don't want to sound, I think I just think that, objectively speaking, if you're looking at one party controlling the House, the Senate, and the White House, and this chaotic flurry of 100 days, and then the smoke clears, and there's just not much of a record of policy achievement, which is our focus at Vox, it's very difficult to call this a very successful first 100 days.
Mm-hmm. For Nikki and Brian, I wonder, as someone who covered the campaign, there was this constant whirlwind of news. In any given rally, Donald Trump would say 5 or 6 things that could be a headline for any other candidate.
Right.
I wonder, now that he has become president, in the first 100 plus days, I wonder how you would assess, and I hate to say the media because that's such a broad term that it encapsulates a lot, but I'm going to break my own rule here. But how would you, has the media, have legacy news organizations at the broadcast level, at the print level, have they adjusted to the President Trump pace? Is there a significant difference in what you're seeing in terms of coverage from the campaign to what we're seeing now in the White House?
Well, I definitely think as far as the pace goes, the pace doesn't feel like it has slowed down. So if one of the criticisms is that there's a shiny object problem where you're continuously chasing the new headline instead of really focusing in on longer term stories, then I think that many places in journalism still have that shiny object problem. But there is some very strong longer term reporting that's going on, so that shows some adapting. And I also think that there's been so much introspection among journalists about how to do their jobs better. I think there is more care being taken in how they describe.
Are you seeing results with that? Are you seeing an actual? Do you feel like the introspection that journalists are doing is there something concrete that has emerged from that?
I do feel like and maybe this is just from hanging out with journalists on Twitter, but there does seem to be a little bit of easing back and not jumping to conclusions immediately. Because I think at the very beginning of the Trump administration and throughout the campaign, there was sort of this Trump exceptionalism where you assumed that every single thing that Donald Trump did was new and shocking and dangerous. And I do think, for the most part, you're seeing more and more journalists adapting to that and not being so quick to assume that everything is exceptional and awful.
Brian, did you want to jump in?
Thinking about the framing of the first 100 days, I kept coming back to the dishonesty. That, to me, that was the hallmark feature of the first 100 days. As a media reporter, it was the dishonesty. And of course, that starts on January 20th. It was raining, and the president said it was sunny. And then it goes up until this weekend in Pennsylvania, saying bullshit about the New York Times again and attacking the media again, et cetera. The dishonesty is, to me, the sort of the through line to all of this. The other through line, I think, of the first 100 days is, if you want to be generous, you could call it sloppiness. Sloppiness meaning misspelled words on press releases and lack of updates to the website and failures from the podium with facts. If you don't want to be generous, you could call it incompetence. But something between sloppiness or incompetence is the other through line to all these stories. It's a person on a stationary bike pedaling really hard but not getting anywhere, and maybe not even pedaling that hard. We can debate the speed of the bike ride. To me, I think what that all relates to is the sense that the conservative entertainment complex is winning, and intellectuals or thought leaders or folks that are trying to make legislative progress are losing. The conservative entertainment complex, the Hannitys of the world, to pick on an easy Fox News host, that sort of approach toward politics is winning, meaning a lot of bombast, a lot of promises, a lot of bluster, a lot of showmanship, a lot of surprise, a lot of
But how are they winning? Like, define winning,
didn't they win
right?
when Trump won?
What do you mean by that?
Winning meaning we're not seeing laws passed. We're not meaning the talkers or the entertainers are the ones that have Trump's ear and are and is the behavior we're seeing. Let me try a different way. The president is acting more like a Fox News host than he is acting like a leader, a lawmaker, a Paul Ryan.
And for what it's worth, this is probably the first president ever that has had the approval of the Limbaughs, the Mark Levins, of the Laura Ingrams. This is the first. This is the first president they can look at and say that's our guy.
Right.
And so it's kind
some of his behavior is related. It's the changing the story, telling a new story today, but telling one pretty consistent story the whole time about the other versus you, us versus them, the fake media versus the real Americans. He's telling one kind of consistent story, which is very much a conservative talk radio and Fox News story. But then within that, he's surprising people every day, today saying we should shut down the government, doing something new every day to keep it interesting, all these reality TV tropes. To me, that causes sloppiness.
But what's interesting to me, I think, is if you look at one of the overarching conservative media narratives of the last 8 years is the refrain around repeal Obamacare, and this has been arguably like the biggest failure of the Trump administration so far. So even though he is, taken on this conservative pundit role in the White House, like how effectual is it? I mean, yes, it wins campaigns. Right. Yes, it won him the White House, but now that he's there, I mean, he's literally saying this is way harder than I thought it would be. And you look at his record and he's not done anything. And I don't see how it'll get any easier for him going forward. So I agree with you in the sort of media analysis and sort of what it means from a sort of overarching storyline and a moment in American history. But I guess when I take it a step back to policy and I look at, what's the end game here? What are the consequences of this sort of new style of politics? And what you're seeing is a real failure of conservative politics, and in terms of policy.
Yeah.
Doesn't that suggest that the Trump conservative media problem is actually a Republican Party conservative media problem that predates Trump? Mm-hmm. That Trump was already a Fox News personality when he first tossed his hat into the ring.
Yeah, right.
And the reason why the base was so susceptible to that is because that's actually what the GOP in Congress had been delivering them for at least the past 4 to 6 years. Repeal and replace was always a slogan. It was always showmanship when they passed those repeal bills.
Right.
And Trump doesn't know how to pass legislation. We saw that with even saying that he would repeal and replace Obamacare in 100 days. That just shows you don't know how that huge legislation gets passed. But also the Republicans in Congress had no idea how to do it.
You were hitting on a point that I feel like connects to Brian's point about dishonesty, which is, I think we've had this debate now in my newsroom about, Paul Ryan and what has been going on for the last 8 or 9 years, and there's various opinions on him, but, the claims that he was making turn out to not really be true. So we've had this kind of dishonest sale of the Republican agenda on Obamacare, essentially, and we're watching it happen. And so, is it so? Anyway, so to speak back to, I guess I'm trying to connect both of your smart points in my own mind about the idea of, a sort of dishonest politics and what are the consequences for policy. And I just see a really interesting through line there.
Can I add just one thought, though, about what he has accomplished? I don't think it's fair to say he's accomplished nothing. He has made his base feel really good. feel really, really good. I mean, when I listen to talk radio, when I read comment threads, when I read Breitbart, his supporters feel better. And that is something real for about 40% of the country. So much of this is just about base emotion. And I mean, basic emotion, but also emotions of the base. And, that is something that's changed in the country. Now there's a group of the country that felt good about the former president, doesn't feel good now. But he has done that, and he's also reinforced divisions in ways that we can't really measure yet. Meaning, when he calls CNN fake every day, it's having an impact in a way that we won't really be able to measure until down the road, maybe years from now. It's that poison that's having a real impact. And actually, if you want to call that an accomplishment, he's accomplished that.
To follow up on Brian's point about conservative media, you hear a lot about, as I mentioned before, the Mark Levins, the Ann Coulters, the Sean Hannitys of the world. You don't hear that as much, like the liberal equivalents.
That's right.
You don't hear that. I don't even know who is the most powerful left-wing radio host. I couldn't even think of a name. Maybe it used to be Al Franken. Maybe I couldn't even think of a name. Whereas
I'm embarrassed to guess because I'm afraid the person I'm thinking of is already off the air. Yeah, it's true.
It was Rachel Maddow, but 10 years ago.
Yeah. So
podcasts are that though.
Right. So I guess Pod Save America.
John,
sure.
that sort of is.
Sure.
Yeah.
But why is it that it seems like conservative media figures are more powerful and more influential and a part of the daily conversation in a way that their liberal equivalents, wherever they may be, are not?
So I wrote a book on this that I think
Teed it up perfectly.
Be helpful. I do think that the answer isn't just about the contemporary media landscape, that for conservatives, the modern conservative movement since the mid-1940s has been built by media activists, by people who were editors and radio hosts and book publishers. And so
I'm sorry, is that unique to conservatives, or is that...
It is, because if you look at the Democratic Party in this period, it is a coalition of interests. It is organizations that are building up the liberal base. And for conservatives, organizations come later. Media come first. So it's National Review that's organizing Young Americans for Freedom. It's a different process. And having media at the heart of that story from the beginning makes it part of the conservative identity to distrust media that present themselves as objective and to seek out media that say, I'm conservative, trust me. And that's something that there has been a conservative audience for half a century. There's no equivalent to that sort of political identity on the left. There might be one building. It seems like increasingly you hear a lot of liberals and people on the left who criticize the mainstream or corporate media, but that has never been as central to the liberal identity as it has been to the conservative identity.
Brian, did you want to jump in on something?
Just that, I think of some of these as anti-media, meaning they exist only because they oppose the traditional media. If you were to take away from Sean Hannity's radio and television shows the option to talk about the press, there's not much else he would talk about. Like half of his show would be silence. That's how much he is talking about the press, what he calls the alt-left propaganda media. I just want to recognize how impactful that is. Like the consequences, which is why you wrote about it. Like the consequences of that daily reinforcement, telling you we're lying. There's no version of that on the left.
Can you guys think of Donald Trump? Sean Hannity has the ear of Donald Trump, as does Ann Coulter, as do some of these. And I noticed in an interview, I think over the weekend, I wish I could remember who it was. It might have been Bloomberg, where Trump actually used that term alt-left, what they used to mention. And the only other person that I heard say that term. Right, the only other person that I heard is Sean Hannity.
Yep.
And so either he's watching. Something that's interesting, and I want to kind of move to the cable news side of this. And Brian, I got to pick on you a little bit here. But we have a president that watches cable news.
Yep.
He apparently used to watch Morning Joe a lot, claims he no longer does. But he will literally, the world can watch Fox and Friends with him because he's tweeting about it.
Right.
Is there a systemic issue with the way that cable... So Sam B had the Correspondents' Dinner on Saturday, not the White House Correspondent, and she went after CNN in particular very hard, saying that Jeff Zucker has pushed the network away from news, and it's more about punditry. Is there a systemic issue right now in cable news, and this is the question that's open to all three of us, or all three of you guys, is there a systemic issue with cable news in how they present the news? Is there too much punditry? Is it productive?
Yeah. This panel is titled Bringing Truth Back. And if you're a cable news anchor or cable news host and you're not advocating for the truth, then you're not doing your job. I think we can pick on some folks. I would personally pick on folks at other networks, but you could pick on folks for not advocating for the viewer enough in those situations where you've got a bunch of pundits, a bunch of partisans squabbling at each other. I just think it puts a lot of pressure on the anchor. And I think of Anderson Cooper as an example of this. He's got 8 people, 4 on each side, and he knows and he does step in when necessary when it gets too loud, too heated, and too far from the facts. I see that happening, but then I also see times where the anchor's not stepping in enough. That's to me the issue. To me, the issue is not whether we have these folks on the air, whether we pay them. It's making sure the anchor, the host, is being the leader and enforcing sort of basic, we're all going to acknowledge this is a fact and that's not. I see times where we fall down on that. I personally have on my program, when you go back and watch the tape and then you regret not interrupting and butting in and being forceful enough on facts.
And it's also easy for me to say, oh man, Brian should have jumped in there. I'm not the one in the chair on live TV.
Thanks
it's
for
a
saying
little
that.
Monday morning quarterback.
But on Sunday I had 3 journalists around the table, including Carl Bernstein, with Jason Miller, who is a Trump comms director, now a CNN commentator. I got a lot of hate mail from people saying he shouldn't be on a show called Reliable Sources. I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong because he's reflecting what about 40% of the country feels about the press. The divide that exists is so so ugly right now. I think you need to see his point of view, and then you need journalists to jump in and rebut it. To me, that is what CNN can do that other channels can't.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just suggest that cable news is often the place where we can most easily point to these issues, but I actually think that it's something that people have been complaining about for newspapers as well, right? This idea of false equivalency has been part of that, and this again is a longer systemic change. If in the 1950s and 60s, objective journalists were deferring too much to official sources of information, by the 60s and 70s, they stopped doing that. And instead, they replaced that deference with, well, the way that we're going to show we're objective is we're going to be balanced. We're going to talk to this person on the right and this person from the left. This is when you get point counterpoint on 60 Minutes. And that's the model that is still persisting. It gets sort of weaponized with Crossfire in the 1980s and 1990s, but this is a model we've been living with for a while. It's been under a lot of criticism for the last 5 to 10 years, where people are saying this isn't a great way for us to understand what's going on in the world. And I think part of the turmoil that we're seeing in media right now and journalism right now is that this old model has been breaking down for a while, and now we need something new to replace it.
That's very interesting. And speaking of new models of media, this is for Laura. Vox is, there's a lot of criticism of, again, I'm going to put this in quotes, media and how we did in 2016, but I'm of the personal belief that we actually saw some of the best journalism we'll ever see in covering that campaign. But Laura, you work for what is, in essence, a place that analyzes and distills and breaks down policy. That's what Vox was established to do. But here you had a candidate that was not concerned with policy. He pretty much said he doesn't, he's not interested in delving into the details of policy. He appeared this weekend in an interview with John Dickerson, did not seem to know his own healthcare plan. How does someone that runs the political coverage of a place that focuses on the details of policy, how do you adapt to that?
So I recently downloaded a meditation app, but it's been a rough road for us at Vox. I think one of the things that we're a policy-focused website at Vox, but one of the I think guiding principles for us, and it's if you look at say cable news, there's a real push on cable news for things that are new, like breaking new, right. This happened, and right. Getting people to addictively tune into the thing that is brand new. And at Vox, we de-emphasize what's new, I don't really care so much what just happened. I care what matters. I care what's interesting. I care what ideas are interesting. And so that was still our guiding principle to the campaign, though we had to still cover the story as it was unfolding. So I think for us, in the era of Trump, it's a constant conversation in our newsroom of how can we tell the story of what's happening right now in a way that is useful to our audience. I like to think about our audience as, my friend from college who is now a doctor, and she's not on Twitter all day. She's, operating on people. And at the end of the day, she hears some ambient thing about, oh, Donald Trump is meeting with this leader from the Philippines, and it seems like it seems bad, and, what does that mean? And she can come to Vox and read an explainer on why this is so controversial and why people are concerned about it. And that's what we're trying to offer people, is sort of these explainer, like taking an event that maybe seems like a flap and turning it into something that can help people understand the state of our politics and policy.
This kind of leads into an interesting dichotomy here. I want to go back to something. Laura said, or excuse me, Nikki said. You were talking about how you felt like reporters now were not jumping as much when Donald Trump says something, like they were during the campaign. I think that there might be some people in the audience that might wonder, well, isn't that quote unquote normalizing him? Because a lot of the things that we were shocked by during the campaign, even they were all shocking. So is there a legitimate criticism to be made that we should continue to be shocked?
Sure. My criticism of the earlier coverage wasn't that people were reacting in shock. I mean, I think that shock is an appropriate reaction to a lot of these things. It's that they were reacting without checking. So, for instance, when the U.S. attorneys were dismissed, well, everyone lost their nut on Twitter, and then everyone finds out that this is normal.
To be fair, not everyone. I mean,
not everyone.
Some dumb people.
No, but
most people don't do that.
But
right?
Reporters do, absolutely.
I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, they have an immediate
There's
reaction.
some bad behavior
like,
on Twitter, but like real journalists don't jump and overreact on Twitter, right?
I definitely.
Right?
I don't know that that's the perfect example, but I remember the turning point.
I'm just trying to defend like real journalists in
like,
newsrooms who just work.
Like, remember when CNN had that great chyron? It was like Trump : Obama founded ISIS, and in parentheses that not true. Right. And it was like amazing, because I feel like that was the moment where CNN was like, let us just like be really clear that we're not doing that, like not true. But it was, I can't think of an example to the counter. I know what you're saying, but I'm trying to find a better example of like people latching onto something. I mean, I think one that was, I'm trying to think, like, I thought that people really latched onto like new emails, the Hillary Clinton new emails around the,
are you talking about the Comey letter?
This is around then, yeah. Like that was one where it was like, oh my God, new emails, and then it turned out they weren't new emails. They were the
so let's
emails.
discuss
and
that.
that to me was something that actually had an impact on the campaign, and it was reporters seizing onto this detail, which turned out to not be the case, and had an actual argument.
Well, I think the Justice Department is a cool example, though, because it's an example of this is a common practice when there's a changeover in government. With Trump, it always feels different to a lot of people, and there's that urgency to react. So, and we should all advocate, and I think we do in our newsrooms, for people to not do that, right?
So
to not
speaking about the Comey
freak
letter,
out.
the Comey letter in particular, and now please keep in mind now. The New York Times in particular came under a lot of criticism for how it covered that Comey letter. Now, I wasn't there when this happened, by the way. I left my helmet at home, so please don't. But Hillary Clinton just today, partially laid the blame of her election loss on the way that both the Comey letter and implicitly the way that the Comey letter was covered. Again, not everybody covered it the same way, but is her beef legitimate? And that's a question that's open to anybody here.
I'm going to dive in and say, like, so one thing I was going to think when I was thinking about this panel around fake news, like, I think Hillary Clinton's biggest problem during the campaign was like real news. Like the coverage of her emails was just devastating for her in terms of her. It stuck. It definitely stuck. People associated emails with a sort of negative swirl around her, and it spoke to sort of this negative theme around her and the Wall Street thing. So I do think it hurt her for sure. Like the relentless coverage, and the thing with Trump was there was like 1 million storylines, and with her there was this one through line.
But was the coverage unfair? I guess is the question. Sure.
I think it was. Yeah. I think it was unfair. I think like 6 articles of this Comey letter calling them new emails was just like over the top a few days before the election, and then like the framing of the headlines was just not accurate.
Brian?
Right, and I was going to throw it out as an open question, whether you all thought that the media were able, for various reasons, journalists were able to sustain attention to those emails for months and months and months and months in a way that it didn't seem like there was sustained attention to particular Trump storylines, that it was so easy because there was so much news to get pulled into every new headline and not necessarily sustain attention on any one thing, maybe because there was too much news. But there is a real contrast between that sort of like constantly developed one storyline and the million storylines, and if that doesn't skew the way people understand the level of scandal in both campaigns.
I think that's a very good point, because something I dealt with on the campaign is that Donald Trump was a news-making machine.
Yeah.
Beast.
At any given rally, there's 8 different headlines.
And she could have done that. She made choices not to do that.
Yeah.
She made a lot of choices not to make news, not to be interesting.
I do think, though, Trump was a unique candidate, though, in terms of just getting headlines. I mean, if you think about it, just after taking office, he said, there are 3 to 5 million illegal voters. And that's something that, for any other candidate, any other president, that's a huge, roiling scandal.
But it was.
For about a couple weeks. I don't think it had the lasting. I mean, we're 3 months away from that.
Right. That's why I say the through line is dishonesty, but we need to pull that out and make that the story. And I think some folks do. Mm-hmm. I was on Clinton. I've tried not to go back too much to October in my mind.
Right.
I did do a self-assessment. I read all the transcripts of all my shows to make sure that I felt that I didn't screw up too badly on my hour on CNN. My biggest regret was not covering Bernie more, not taking him more seriously early on, not talking more about Bernie in 2015. I made the assumption a lot of other people did about Clinton's, dominance in the primary. My regrets weren't really about Trump; they were about Bernie.
That's interesting, because that's not something I've.
Yeah, we don't talk about it enough.
Ever.
About
that's the first time. Don't get me wrong. I've heard it from Bernie folks.
Right.
But I've never heard a member, a working journalist, look in the mirror and say, you know what, the Sanders should have paid more attention to Bernie Sanders.
Because what was going on with his supporters was similar in some ways to what was going on with Trump supporters, and with regards to frustrations about inequality and such. So I just didn't see that early enough. On Clinton, we're in a cable news age, and that might be a horrible thing or it might be a wonderful thing, and President Trump leaned into that in a way that she didn't. To me, that's one of the primary takeaways. How do any announcement about emails 9 days before an election is going to be a huge story. Did she lose because of it? Probably. The polling indicates that she's right, that she would have won in October. I think that's pretty clear. Let's also remember that she did win. I mean, I know that's a fun, thing to talk about the popular vote. To the degree that we blame the media, some folks like to blame the media for getting Trump elected. We must not have done a very good job if he lost the popular vote. If he is continued to be so deeply disliked. I'm putting that out there.
And the culpability there is something that has to be teased out, because yes, the way that the Comey announcement was framed, I think there were some real problems there. But also, the FBI director came out and made this big announcement right before the election, and
which was unprecedented, by the way.
Journalists had to cover that, and I think they had to draw attention to the unprecedented nature of it, and didn't have enough information to, at that time. I mean, had some information that.
I don't know. I think I don't have it's, and I also don't like to give the media I think we overstate the amount of influence we even have, but
yes,
we're like, yes, as the most important sport.
Don't tell them.
I know, yeah. We're very powerful.
This election was about
race.
But
I just think, I don't recall 3 or 4 headlines on the front page of the New York Times when it was pretty clear that Russia was involved in helping the Trump campaign, and then it was Clinton emails, and there were at least 3 stories above the fold on the Comey letter. I do think that there is a bias sort of around Clintonian scandal is a tempting subject in the media to cover. It just is.
Absolutely.
And I think that was part of what we saw happen after the Comey letter, that yes, of course that's going to be covered if the FBI director puts this out, unprecedented. But I think the framing of it and the extent of the coverage was pretty breathtaking, especially when you compare it to some of the other breathtaking storylines that were coming out throughout the campaign that did not receive the same treatment.
So I want to get into one more question before we start taking some audience questions. the other cause that Hillary Clinton said led to her loss was WikiLeaks. And simple question, was it ethical for news organizations to use those emails and publicize them?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I wrestle with it in my head. I'm going to try to avoid the question.
No, answer the question.
No, it's a great
You think
question.
Brian Stelter, host
It's
of
a-
Reliable
it's a
Sources,
great-
would let a panelist get away with
It's
that?
a great question. That's why it's such a struggle. I mean, I remember that one of the days that Fox News did, boom, Fox News alert, breaking news, WikiLeaks dump number 11 of the Clinton emails. It created this sense that something big was in the Podesta emails that wasn't. Those emails have been misused and abused and exploited 1,000 times now against some of our colleagues and others.
Sure, totally. Nikki, go ahead.
I don't know about the
I think
ethical
it's-
piece.
In exploring that question, which I also do not have easy answers to, you also have to introduce the other side of it, which is that what if they hadn't covered it? What would the storyline
Totally,
have been?
it's exactly right, yeah.
And if you do have, and I think that by and large, one of the powers of conservative media is their ability to drive the coverage of other outlets. And I think that would have been doubly true in that case and would have just reinforced the sense that media were biased against Trump.
I think, again, it goes back to the frame of a story. If you can go back to a number of outlets that there is a draw to look like you have a Clinton scoop and like a Clinton scandal scoop there's just a bias towards it, I think, in political journalism. So to say,
But that probably goes both
leaked-
ways, right? That also goes to his Trump.
I would say Clinton, relative to another Democrat or
Sure.
another Republican, that this is just, the Clintons are a unique class of political figures and have a unique relationship with the media, and the media, anyway, that's a whole other topic. But in any case, there were many examples where you would see a story and it would talk about a leaked email, and to me, leak means like whistleblower has released
Right,
something.
it should say stolen.
But it was not
Yeah.
leaked. It was hacked. Like it should have been a hacked email or a stolen
Stolen
email.
is the word we should be
or
at,
like
yeah.
allegedly, with ties to Russia given to website. Like none of it. And it was WikiLeaks was referred to as like was often
Like a
referred
news
to as like
service.
a whistleblower or whistleblower website or this. And it was like, no, this is completely. This is looking like Hillary Clinton was up to something and somebody leaked it, and that's just not what happened. And I think in the context of this separate email scandal, it created this cloud of email. And I think it's difficult in the media sometimes when we look, we're all doing our job every single day, but to like step back, and I think something we tried to do at Vox is look at like, okay, we did a huge diagram of email scandal, like, and it had all these prongs. I'm like, how do we trying to explain to people what this email scandal is about? And it's not one scandal, it's three, and it's difficult. But I think that like Nikki said, you have to cover things that are out there in the world. You do. I mean, otherwise, I think it is worthwhile for CNN or other responsible news outlets to take a story and cover it well. But we have an obligation to be honest and fair, and to resist temptation to make something sound salacious when it's not.
And we need news consumers to want that kind of high quality reporting, that kind of high quality information.
Boom, they do.
They don't.
I
You
mean,
think
we
a lot of I know.
I don't know.
We're both right.
I don't know.
We're both right. A lot of folks do. A lot of folks don't.
A lot
I
of
mean,
folks do. I mean, I think you can get.
I think one of the
There is a panoply of things that get the clicks, right? And like, yes, there are some temptations. Like, look, I could start a fake news site and get a lot of clicks, but that's not what I do with my life. Like, I'm going for a different direction. But I do think that there is. Anyway, I take your point about the sort of like business imperative to attract an audience. For sure.
I just something is profoundly broken when half the country believes some of the BS that has been sold the first 100 days. There's something profoundly broken, and that involves our media ecosystem, this alternative reality that you can subscribe to, sites that will tell you that Obama did personally tap Trump's phones, like that. Those people are not seeking out high quality sources, and that's not entirely on them. It's partly on the folks that are selling them that stuff. It's partly on Facebook for making it easy to find, and it's partly on the consumers for being willing to believe it. I mean, there's this spectrum of news, and we'd like to think we all work for places on the far end of the highest quality of the spectrum. But then there's a lot in the middle that isn't fake, but it's just crap.
Yeah.
It's
Crap
not news.
is the real problem. I think people who
Yeah,
rate
it's
fake
news
news,
like
it's
substance.
like
Yeah.
I mean, like the Salem witch trials is like village fake news. Like there's going to be people who want the fake news and are going to believe it no matter what. But like to me, that what was worrisome about the Hillary sort of email stuff was like it was from middle of the road all the way up to the highbrow coverage, and it was influencing people who, shall we say, would not normally believe like, you know, the sex ring behind the pizza parlor, whatever crazy story, you know, like that, that this was having an effect, and or it was like depressing the vote in some areas where people felt like, I don't want to get involved in voting, and because of that coverage, and I don't think that we in the media can really control like fake news or really even sort of anything on that line of crap to fake. Like I can't do much about that, but I can look at what I do and think about, am I representing things fairly? And the fact that at the end of this election, we have these instances to look back on, I think, you know, is sort of troubling to me.
Well, let me jump in here with a follow-up. I knew I said questions, but hang with me here, folks. I wonder, I would question how much of an influence fake news had on the election. Fake news, obviously I know has lost all meaning, but I mean, for about 2 weeks after the election...
It was a great time. We could all agree on the term.
Right, but there was like a 2-week period after the election when fake news had a very specific meaning.
Stories designed to deceive you, trying to trick you.
Pizzagate being
Hoaxes.
one of them. You know, hoaxes, right.
Yeah.
But I wonder how much of an influence it actually had on the election. And I think about the 60 million people that did vote for Donald Trump. The vast, vast majority of that 60 million, if probably 100%, knew certain things about Donald Trump. They knew he wanted to build a wall. They knew at some point that he wanted to ban all Muslims from entering the United States. They knew about the Access Hollywood tape. They knew about the fact that he'd never been in office before. You were at debates and you heard what he said about Vladimir Putin and some of the other stuff he said, and they voted for him anyway. And I wonder if some of this is just a good deal of the media or Hillary Clinton voters that are trying to rationalize the fact that this guy won with an unfair advantage. And I wonder if it's just a simple matter of this guy. There's 60 million people in the country that just liked him better than they liked Hillary Clinton.
I'm with you. This election was about race, class, and gender. It was baked a long time before November 8th. Most Trump supporters were with him many, many months before there were fake stories saying that the Pope had endorsed him. I think those stories had an impact around the margins, though, making people hate Hillary more. Making people, I think...
But they probably would have voted for him anyway.
Yeah, right. Maybe they got a little more fired up by fake stories. Of course, almost impossible to tell at this point. But I agree with you. It was mostly only on the margins that these stories had impacts. But maybe the margins mattered in some places.
People weren't tricked into thinking Donald Trump was something other than he was. I mean, he said the things he said, and people heard the things he said, and they made that choice anyway. And we can talk about fake news or Russian interference or all of these different things, and they're worthy topics to talk about, but at the end of the day, people made a choice. I mean, the fact that Donald Trump had become the Republican candidate and that 60 million people, almost all of them Republicans, voted for him, whether it's because they were going to get a Supreme Court justice out of it or because they liked his rhetoric on the wall and on the Muslim ban. I mean, there's a wide range of reasons why people voted for him, but they can't say that they were tricked into thinking he was something that he wasn't.
Right. He made them feel good. I mean, you saw it. You were
totally.
there. You saw it. I mean,
I would go to rallies.
One of my other regrets, I talk about my regrets, I didn't go to a big rally. I only went to his small events. I never saw him in the stadiums. I saw him at the convention, but never in the stadiums, and I wish I could have the way you did.
I went to hundreds of rallies in more than 40 states, and his rallies weren't rallies, they were concerts.
Yeah.
It would be like in these 10,000-seat stadiums, sometimes 15, 20,000, and people would line up at like 5 or 6 in the morning. They'd be dressed like him. It'd be like Woodstock. and he'd come out and he wouldn't have a teleprompter, at least for the first year or so. And then he would, say things like, "We're going to build a wall." And the crowd reacts like it's Springsteen hitting the first notes to Born to Run. It's like, and he, over the weekend, he did a rally in Harrisburg where he does this poem called The Snake. And he used to do that on the campaign trail. He just spoken word poetry. And the snake is supposed to be an allegory for refugees. And there's people in the back mouthing the poem along with him because that's how much of a fervent support base he had. But it was certainly unlike anything that any other candidate in recent history has had. Certainly.
Do you have regrets?
Do I have regrets? Ooh, excuse me, I'm the moderator here, sir. The God's honest truth, no, I don't. I'm at peace. This goes back to the conversation, what I alluded to before.
Do you think the election will ever end, by the way?
No.
Honestly.
I do know there's a reason I went to go cover culture for a while.
Right.
But I will say that the media is not a monolith, and how CBS covered the election is not the way that everyone else covered the election. How the Times covered the election is different than how the Washington Post covered it. So we had a different approach than some of the other networks. And also, one of the things that gets lost here, and for example, CNN gets criticized a decent amount for airing his rallies start to finish early on. But the truth is, CNN also has a very vibrant digital section, and all the networks that do incredible work. So I'm actually very at peace with the way, for example, that CBS covered the election. Yeah. But enough about me. Let's get to your questions. I guess I'll just call, and if that's okay. And how about that gentleman right there in the brown jacket? And we have a microphone for you. Go ahead.
I've been thinking a lot about civic responsibility on the politicians' end recently, and between the parties. Does more of the civic responsibility fall to the party head or the candidate, and at a local level or on a nationwide level? And so I'm just wondering, on the media end, on the journalistic end, where do you guys think in this world of infotainment where you need clicks and you need to hold viewers through the commercial and you need those ratings and you need to sell the books, where does this civic responsibility land? On the editors, on the heads of the networks, or on an individual show? Congratulations on the Cronkite Award, by the way, Brian.
Thank you.
That I feel like sometimes it's like, we need the viewers to be interested in the important stuff, but where does the responsibility land on the media side to provide that quality information?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that first. I think the media companies, especially the heads of media companies, should be investing in media literacy, or investing more in media literacy, helping folks understand how to use all the stuff we've been given. I mean, in the last 10 years, we've been given the most incredible technology ever known to man, these smartphones that are allegedly really smart, that allegedly give us access to the whole world. And then we've been given Facebook, which allows us to connect to the whole world and talk to everybody in the world. We've been given these tools, and we haven't really been taught how to use them. Mm-hmm. And if I could take a month off, what I would study is the effect of social networks on the election, 2008 versus 2016. I don't know what they were. I'd love to study that. I think that's so for both the tech companies and the media companies. More should be being done, and money should be spent on the literacy side of it, on the how to use these tools. And just to give a practical example on that, at CNN, we may not be on television doing the in-depth policy reporting that is online, that's available on the website, on CNN.com. We need to better help people know where it is, how to find it, how the dots are connected between TV and web. Mm-hmm. There are technological solutions to this also, right? Your TV should be smart enough to be able to, when Anderson says something, when I say something, it should be able to pop up on your phone. There should be technological solutions to some of the problems that I think we're currently confronting. I'm actually surprised there hasn't been more innovation in the past 4 or 5 months. Like, I'm surprised there haven't been more startups that have emerged out of the ashes of this election. We can see there's some things that are broken in folks' media consumptions and our media diets and our habits. It's a lot of room to create new stuff.
Sure, but I would say that technological solutions are only going to get you ever part of the way there, right?
Because it's companies that are coming up with them and algorithms.
Well, I mean, even more than that, like, these are social problems more than they are technological problems. Yeah. And so making it more clear in reporting, this is how we know what we know. Here are the facts that we're relying on. Here's how we know that they are facts. But also as a professor, it's not just the responsibility of politicians, it's not just the responsibility of media. I mean, it's the challenge that we face in the classroom, which is we've gone generationally from teaching students how to find information because it's buried away in a library somewhere, to having students inundated with so much information and not knowing how to tell, is this source good? Is this source bad?
It's changed so fast, hasn't it?
So fast. And so there's
like in the blink of an eye.
There's a generational project of civic education that has to happen, and media are part of that. Politicians should be part of that, but I wouldn't count on them. And professors and citizens, we're all part of this project because we're adapting to a radically altered technological landscape, and technology can be part of the solution, but education and society have to be a major driver of it.
And don't forget, Twitter was not, looking at the example of Twitter, how fast technology moves. In 2012, Twitter was not nearly the impact on the election that now it's like a must-have for all journalists. But in 2012, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, they were not, it was not nearly as active as a vehicle for news. Now it's one of the chief ones.
And are these tools making us hate the so-called other side more than they're allowing us to? These tools allow us to hear from and know and engage with everyone, and yet it seems a lot of folks go the opposite way when able to do that.
Right. Let's take another question. Front row, right here.
One of the criticisms leveled at the mainstream media, I think, was whether you ignored, and I say you in a very broad sense, the mainstream media ignored the Trump voter, didn't report on them, didn't get down on the ground. And you guys have kind of talked about whether you have regrets on reading your transcripts, and I'm just wondering if there's any truth to that criticism.
I will answer this kind of obliquely, and then other people can pile on and criticize what I say. But I mean, I think that since the election, there's been a lot of attention to a particular kind of Trump voter. And that's actually what I was thinking when you were describing the rallies, Sopan, is that there are these very enthusiastic Trump voters, and there are these white working class West Virginian Trump voters, and then there are all of the run-of-the-mill Republicans who voted for Trump.
And held their nose doing it.
And held their nose doing it, but votes count, regardless of how you're standing when you pull the lever. And so I think that there has actually not been enough attention paid to the broader range of who Trump voters were, because I do think there's a tendency to fall into the caricature of who Trump voters are, this forgotten man and woman that Trump would like you to believe they are, but not the finance capital guy who voted for him.
Do you know the Trumpiast during the we did this we never did the story, we should have anyway we looked for during the primary season, I was like, we gotta find the Trumpiest county in America, what was the Trumpiest the place where Trump had the biggest margin in the primary, and we're gonna do a video and big reveal, it's Staten Island is the Trumpiest Trump district in America. And so I guess I feel similarly about this idea of we just needed more breathless stories about sad times in dusty parts of America where the local mill is closed. And I mean, those exist. Many of those stories exist, but a lot of the story of Trump was, to me, America is polarized, and the vast majority of Democrats voted for the Democratic candidate, and the vast majority of Republicans voted for the Republican candidate, and that's what happened here.
I wonder if we needed more stories about pain.
Not about who?
Pain. About people's pain. Not about Trump voters, but about suffering and hardship and breakdown of community in these places, and how those folks tended to back Trump. What's that line that Chris Arnott has about he was seeing hope leave communities, and he was seeing drugs and Trump come in. And still at that rally over the weekend, you could see how Trump is a drug. You could see it. I call his rhetoric poison, but you can see the high people get.
Should we have had more stories looking at very poor immigrant communities that were supporting Hillary Clinton? There weren't. I didn't see too many of those types of profiles.
I'm with you on that, and I think.
What about painful? I think that there's this sort of struggle in the media to really want to empathize with voters and to give them the benefit of the doubt. And maybe these people didn't vote for Trump because he was going to build a wall, ban Muslims, and whatever else, but there's something else is going on that there's some unspoken truth here that if we could just go and reveal the truth of people's pain, we would get the answer.
You're saying maybe it was just racism.
Or maybe people voted for Trump based on the platform he ran on.
Right. But to her point, that's a question I get a lot. But let me flip it, and she kind of touched on this, is are we, in our haste to try to figure out the Trump voter, are we now moving too far away from the 63 million that
right, that's now the point where,
So
right.
What I wonder is, and how do we get at that?
Well, shouldn't we be interviewing, the collective we, all voters more? In other words, push the coverage more toward people who are making the choices, as opposed to our talking heads, right? I was going to, when you asked your question, I was going to use it as a chance to defend our pro-Trump commentators, right? Because CNN went out and purposely hired Jeffrey Lord and then a bunch of others in order to reflect the Trump voter perspective. Now, there are flaws with that move because by virtue of being a television talking head, you're an elite. And you're not.
Yeah, Jeffrey Lord, the common man.
But there's an attempt there, a good faith attempt to hear the Trump voter perspective.
Brian,
and to his credit, he does live in the middle of Pennsylvania, not New York City.
So since you did mention it, and I did bring this up backstage, which
Yeah.
is that it's one thing to have the Trump voter or Trump voice on. It's another thing to pay them for it, right? Am I wrong on that? It's another thing to have them on as an employee of the network. Because A, it changes the discourse with the anchors, right? Because the anchors don't go as hard at Jeffrey Lord and Jason Miller now that they're, Jason Miller in particular is someone I point to, not with you, I'm talking about,
Yeah.
he's an employee. You can't call him a liar on the air. It's harder to do that. So CNN is the only network that pays people just to come on and be what you call the voice of the Trump voter. And
First I disagree. Fox and MSNBC have a lot of contributors.
But not Jeffrey Lord types, though. Not just people to come on and we need you to defend Trump. It's not like that other networks. But I could be wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong. I just can't think of an example.
Right. What CNN did is different because of the problem associated with this election, which was most Republican commentators on television were avoiding Trump very, very aggressively. I think one way to hear from Trump voters or hear the Trump perspective on the world is to hire those people so that they're accessible at all times. It's easier to book them when you pay them. The great people on TV will eventually insist on being paid. I think if we're going to reevaluate all paid commentator deals, I just don't think that's realistic in television news.
Right.
If you're not going to have Van Jones and you're not going to have Jeffrey Lord, you're going to get rid of hundreds of people. To me, it's just not realistic given the medium of television, the need
You got to fill
to
24
hear,
hours.
the need to have all those perspectives. However, I'm always pushing for let's get a few more reporters and a few less partisans. If we can have a different balance, have more reporters on to challenge those partisans of both sides, including the liberals who are misleading on air, then. To me, that's a better balance. My concern about coverage of Trump voters during the campaign was this treatment of them like an exotic species. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to continue to be sensitive to treat any group of folks supporting a candidate as an exotic, zoo animal sort of thing. But to the extent that we can be hearing from all voters more, we should. And I'm really curious about the folks that didn't vote. I'd like to see some pieces about that.
And for full disclosure with CNN, they also made a real attempt to hire incredible reporters like David Fairholt and Abby Phillip for the Washington Post.
Right.
So it's not like they're just looking around and Jeff Zucker, for what it's worth, has gone out of his way to come with a variety of voices.
And you'll notice that someone like Scotty Nell Hughes is no longer at CNN, and she's the person that said there is no such thing as facts anymore. She didn't last much longer after that.
Oh, I didn't know she left. Okay.
Didn't happen. Wasn't that loud, but if you notice, she's not there anymore.
All right, let's get another question in. Let's go to the back. That gentleman right there, way in the back. There's a microphone coming your way, sir.
Yeah, Brian, as you were saying about the importance of facts and truth, how do we get, as the panel's entitled, how do we get back to that? Why is truth still important when we have Trump and the Republicans pushing item after item without much truth behind it, when we have a health care plan moving its way through Congress right now that hasn't been scored? And the facts don't seem to be all that important anymore.
So, from what I can understand of your question, and I'll leave it for the panel, so there seems to be, I believe what he's asking is, how does the media get back to, how do we do a better job to make sure that it's more factual, that the facts are getting out there more? How do we reach the people that maybe don't believe us right now?
I don't know that there's an easy solution to this, because I think that many of the cable news networks, many of the papers of record have been very insistent on putting forward facts. Fact-checking has become a cottage industry over the past decade. I think it's important to understand that that this is part of a decades-long battle over how we know what we know about the world. And that battle has been taking place in the media between ideas of what objective reporting looks like, between ideas of trust us because we're ideologically in line with you, and you're not going to just win people over who believe that they should be listening to voices. If you're a conservative listening to conservative voices, or a liberal listening to liberal voices, to just say, well, here are the facts, if that person's already decided that that's not how they get their information about the world. So the bigger question is, how do you generate trust in non-ideological news sources? And I don't have an answer to that. If I had an answer to that, I'd be in a better paid job. But I think that's the big question. But it has to be understood as not just a recent development, as something that has been going on for a very long time, and that is intrinsic to people's identity, how they understand the world. That's something that you can't just uproot with a fact checker.
One like little nugget of, I don't know, one little nugget of hope or something. I don't know what it's like weird to talk about right now. Because I agree. It just sort of, the polarization in America has just made it so difficult to break through. Like, I want to believe like sets of facts will resonate, but people look at things and through their own identities. But one thing I found interesting specifically in the healthcare bill is, it was so widely disliked by the public. Like, polling was saying like, oh yeah, this bill sounds terrible, we hate this bill. And Congress was responsive to that Republicans in Congress said, well, I'm not gonna vote for this bill, my constituents aren't going to like it. So I don't know exactly what happened there, where people suddenly, like, the two things were kind of in line. I don't know exactly how that happened, but I do think that there have been a number of examples where the American public actually did get a set of facts, like the closing. It was during this like ethics, there was an ethics thing at the beginning of the year where they were going to close this office, and then all of America said, what, that's crazy. And then Congress didn't do it. And then it was, we're going to get rid of, all of these, we're going to change Obamacare to the point that it's, not going to be accessible, healthcare won't be accessible to millions of people. And Americans said, whoa, that's terrible. And Congress was responsive. So we're seeing, like, it's not all hope is lost, that no facts matter anymore, that actually sometimes they do, and we're seeing it in a couple instances where it is really important. So I do think it is possible. I guess I don't want to go, sorry, I'm starting to rant, but share the rule notes on your Facebook pages, people. Like, that's one thing you can do.
And don't forget, let's say for the sake of conversation, if we operate on the premise that Donald Trump is being, Brian said, dishonest, and let's say he loses the next election by a lot, doesn't that, on some way, that's the American people saying this is, that approach to disseminating information?
I very much expect we're going to see a couple candidates in 2020 that make truth-telling their entire platform. I will never lie to you.
I would just say that yes, reality comes home to roost. We saw it happen in 2012 when all of the conservative media were saying that Romney was going to win, and he lost. But I think that could change the media landscape. It hasn't changed the media landscape so far. So I would just say that reality still matters, but it hasn't necessarily pulled people away from their ideological news sources.
All right, let's do another question. Let's go to this side. Go ahead, front row.
Such a great panel. Thank you all. So my question comes from kind of someone who thinks about education, but also as a parent. It sounds like you're all pretty passionate that we need a more informed electorate and better at analyzing this information onslaught. But I'm wondering, I've been concerned at how many teachers, et cetera, say well, I just can't talk about the election in class, right? Or Trump is too unpredictable. We don't know what he's going to say, certainly during the campaign, but even now it's too polarizing, it's too divisive. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about the way we might think about educating young people as educators or as parents to deal with this media landscape in particular in this political moment.
Interesting. So should teachers touch politics? That's very interesting. I'll be honest, that's not something I've thought about very much. I certainly, when I went to middle school and high school, it's not something I thought about very much as a middle school or high school student. Yeah. But secondly, if my teachers did talk about it much, I'm sure there would be a whole host of parents that would suddenly call the school and say, excuse me, Why are you talking about, I don't know, the Iraq War with my kid? I don't know the answer. I would love to hear what you think.
Well, one thing that I do think that there's a difference between this election and previous elections, because when we were kids, we would have mock elections in school, we'd have mock debates, whatever. I went to give a talk at a high school in Charlottesville during the election, and there was this whole class that was around the 2016 election, and they had initially planned to have a mock debate where half the folks took the Trump position and half the folks took the Clinton position. And after the Inside Edition tape came out and after the Muslim ban stuff came out, they were like, we can't make the kids make these arguments. And I do think that's something different. No, I mean, they canceled the debate because
Jesus Christ.
it was... Anyway, they were concerned about the arguments the kids would make because they would echo the Trump line. And
that speaks volumes.
That sounds like an SNL
why it's so
sketch.
fraught.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
It really is. That's incredible. I actually would be more curious to hear what you guys have to say.
Well, and just to the point about education as well. I mean, what I think we should be teaching in its most basic form about media literacy. We need to have a better sense of opinion versus news, news versus entertainment, news versus advertising. The delineations. I mean, it has to start at a very basic level, and then you can get into these thousands of different outlets and what their partisan stripes are. But just those basics of media literacy, and then you can get into news literacy, a related concept that gets into more of the how to be a news consumer.
All right, let's do another question. Let's go to the side. Go ahead, front row one more time.
Back to the dishonesty thing. Will there ever again be consequences for lying? I mean, if you want people to trust the media, tell them the truth. Find the truth, champion the truth, stick up for the fact, call a lie, and don't worry about getting sued. No one's getting sued anymore. So I'm just wondering.
But aren't there consequences for lying when you look at the approval ratings?
Apparently not.
Well, we don't know, right?
Well,
I'm
I'm looking forward to a time when there is a consequence for lying, but right now, not so much. I mean, you seem to be, call it spin, do whatever you want, but it's
But what I'm suggesting to
nothing
you
but lies.
is if he and his aides weren't consistently screwing up, wouldn't he be doing better? Wouldn't he be above 40%? I mean, he's a handsome man with a handsome family. He makes people feel good. He's entertaining. There are positive attributes that a lot of people in the country feel, and yet he's only at 40%. To me, there are consequences for this dishonesty. I think the press has to look inward as well when there are mistakes in newsrooms, big mistakes, when there are NBC nightly news anchors exaggerating stories, when there are these sorts of big moments of media dishonesty, hurts the entire industry. As the comic over the weekend talked about, now you know what it's like to be a minority. When one of you screws up, Trump holds you all accountable. I think we've seen a lot of journalists reinforce basic values since Election Day about accuracy and honesty. I think that's a good thing. We've got to hold ourselves to the highest standards when we're on television saying this man is not telling you the truth. But I'm really proud of what we've seen in terms of television coverage on CBS and CNN elsewhere of folks looking into the camera and being really blunt about what this is and how unusual this is. I've seen some really strong journalism like that.
And just one other example, I mean, one of the places where we saw reality really mattering has been in the court stays. In Trump's interactions with the court, all of a sudden, what he says and whether he's telling the truth or not matters. And so I think there will be instances like that where there are consequences for the words that you say. And so I would look for it in places where reality has consequences.
I do feel you on this, though, because it's just most people, like if I were sitting up here caught in a lie and somebody said to me, but you're lying, like I would feel shame, like I would feel embarrassed and ashamed. Trump is like, I don't feel ashamed. Like I feel fine. Like he it's like his his power comes from the like while others of us would be cowed and ashamed, he's like emboldened and just doesn't care, and it's really frustrating. I mean, it's just frustrating in the media to say like that's a lie, and then it keeps happening.
Right,
So
you're
I feel you on
getting
that.
getting what a lot of journalists feel in newsrooms. Like we could do these jobs. Like Sean Spicer, there's a lot of journalists that could get up there and answer questions and not screw up the way that these people do.
Don't tell lies. Like, just it's just like astounding to me. Some of the things that get said, they're not like, I am quite sympathetic to like the idea of politics as a story and a campaign as a story, and you're trying to, anything is bigger than one individual tiny, shading of the truth. But this is like, no, 3 to 5 million illegal people, like undocumented people didn't vote. Like that just didn't happen. That's just not true. And that's very difficult, I think, when we're sitting in a newsroom, like, how do you deal with that? And you can say it's not true, but it feels like we're living in a parallel universe where our own like basic norms just are in conflict with what's going on around us.
I will say, back in March of 2016, I wrote one of the first pieces about Donald Trump as a gaslighter, and then that term has gotten much overused since then. But I reached for that term because that sense of like, what is going on? Because it was really confusing because you expected truth, and you got repeated lies, and you would go look at the video footage or check out the reports, and you'd be like, but wait, it's not true. But wait, he's still saying it. And that was really dislocating in a very very meaningful way.
Let's not forget that this did not just start with the 2015 with Donald Trump. I mean, let's not forget 2012. In 2012, he led a months and months long campaign saying that the president was not born in this country.
And that's why,
and then said it was Hillary Clinton who did it. And you're like, what? That was gaslighting, because it was like, wait a minute, I'm like scrolling back through
and
old
that was
Twitter,
the first
like,
time,
no, this wasn't what happened.
And that was the first time the New York Times, used the word lie to describe something Donald Trump said. It was a piece written by Michael Barbaro, who's brilliant and wonderful. And that was the first time. But this has been, you almost wonder if that was kind of a test run for him. Let me just, but you don't know. You don't know.
I don't think he has like strategic, like, what am I going to
I think it's just who he is.
But I like
balloon that. No, we'll just
Brian, please go ahead.
Well, I like the phrase that you used, Laura, parallel universe. And I do think we should realize it is that big. Like I have a hard time articulating this on television because I could do an hour every week just about the alternative reality. It is that big. We do have these two parallel universes, and birtherism is a fantastic example of just how big that was, how many people bought into it, how many websites and radio hosts told them to believe it. I mean, we should recognize how big this is.
Right.
Like there's an entire parallel universe.
Totally. All right,
for this stuff.
Back corner over there. I'm giving Bo a little bit of a workout here.
Thanks. So you guys have touched really nice, I think, on the praises and criticisms that we can address to national media. But I'm curious how we can evaluate local news. What criticism we can give. It kind of just feels like local news is just there. It's like a money machine that like you give them money and they spit out news, but there's not much accountability and/or change. Is that where innovation maybe is needed next?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I don't know if you see the Jack Schaefer piece from last week. Look, there's a problem in that local news is disappearing. There are less local newspapers. There are and there are studies that have shown over the years that more people get their news from the local news than they do the national news. So yes, there is a problem. There's more big corporate folks like us and less of your Toledo Gazette types. But I don't know the answer to that other than, subscribe to the Toledo Gazette.
Well, I think that the distrust in media is partly fueled by fading away of local news. When you don't have a personal connection to news outlets and to journalists, if you don't know a journalist, I grew up in a town called Damascus, Maryland, in Montgomery County, and I know that Susan was the editor of the paper. She was at every event. She was writing stories, at my school and things like that. And then in high school, I was able to have a column in the Gazette, and I had that personal connection. But everybody in town knew Susan, right? Everybody in town knew that reporter. If you don't have a Susan, then you're not going to feel as emotionally invested in journalism. You're not going to really know how it works. I think there's something to be said about that connection between that and then distrust of media on the national level. Now, to some degree, Facebook and people's pages on Facebook are becoming new versions of that. They may not even call themselves journalists, but we are seeing those new hubs of local community information, so all those not lost. But I do think there's something about distrust of media related to local news you're also, if you're a local reporter in Milwaukee or Des Moines, you don't feel as comfortable getting in front of the camera and saying that person's not telling the truth. It's not, those values aren't necessarily ingrained the way they are right now at big networks. So I think there's something there too.
I also think it shows the importance of public broadcasting. At places, especially, rural areas very much benefit from public broadcasting funding and, local, and the, a lot of people think, public broadcasting is just NPR and PBS, but actually there are lots and lots of local public access television, and radio all around the country that the local people that live in those areas actually very much rely on to get information about, if there's a storm coming, if there's a tornado or whatever. But that's not something that is very much in the national discussion. That's probably a failure on our part, but that's enough about that. Another question. Right there.
This morning, for the first time, I actually heard someone in the mainstream media, if you want to call them that, Morning Joe, talking about Trump's state of mind.
Yes.
And
That was
possible
striking.
dementia, not to put too fine a point on it. And in the Twitterverse, this has been wild for months, but it's the first time today that I heard the mainstream media pick up the thread, and I'm wondering where you're going to go with that.
I'm going to get you to watch Reliable Sources because
I read you every night
at the
on
end of
Twitter.
February, I think it was, we had Andrew Sullivan on discussing this. And just to give you a sense of my thought process, we taped the interview with Andrew Sullivan ahead of time because we wanted to be very careful and think through the words we were choosing. Because he was questioning Trump's mental state. He wrote about it in print, and then we did it on television. I haven't seen it on television very, very often. What Scarborough was doing this morning was unique, and I sent Mika a message afterwards and said, you're doing something really interesting that others on television want to do and aren't. There's green room conversations that happen. There's makeup room conversations that happen that don't translate onto television, that don't get said on television. And I think that's what they were doing this morning. Joe and Mika were having their off-camera conversation on camera. I think we're going to
kind of
see.
the appeal of the show.
I think we're going to see more of it. But basically,
Yeah.
they were bringing up Trump's mental state in an indirect way, asking if he has dementia, in an indirect way, asking about various illnesses, wondering why his speaking competency is becoming worse over the years. They actually took a clip from the 80s of Trump speaking and then put it against a clip from this weekend to show a decline in mental agility. They were tiptoeing, but they were tiptoeing quite loudly, and everyone knew what they were saying.
Yeah,
and I do think we're going to see more of that. I think
haven't-
from mostly liberal-leaning commentators.
I'll take a look at that before. I didn't see that today. The place that makes me uncomfortable is when we talk about mental illness. Like, I think that there's no reason why someone with mental illness should be barred from public service or anything like. But yeah, so I would just say I'm gonna check that out. But there has also been a separate conversation. There's been a group of psychologists who have signed
Right.
out to a letter saying we think he's mentally ill and we're breaking the standard. So that's just something that I am mindful of, and that's been on our minds of
Right.
not stigmatizing people. But this question
Right.
of I do think that's fascinating of an old speech versus now and measuring measuring the output, but
Although there has to be, I
Right.
mean, there are some ethical lines that are involved here.
Yep.
There's a reason why.
That's why we taped that interview.
Well,
Yeah.
exactly. It's
We
why.
hate taping. We hate
I know. I'm
taping
like,
interviews.
I just heard you like Andrew Sullivan mental. I'm like, oh god,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Don't just-
No, look.
don't
Yep.
put that out there.
But there,
Yep.
there have been articles published, and I can't remember if it was something like the Atlantic or the New Republic, where an actual doctor was sitting there explaining why they thought that Donald Trump had neurosyphilis, and you're just like, that's deeply irresponsible. And I guess you can raise the questions, but again, even the question of mental decline is a medical question, and it gets into some really gray areas, and then you have to ask what the purpose of those conversations are.
I think
tough.
for Joe and Mika, the purpose is to say that Mike Pence should take over. I think that's what the implication of some of the segments were on Maureen Joe this morning.
But say there's nothing medically wrong with Donald Trump. The issue is the decisions he's making and sort of like whether he has a mental illness or he is physically ill, or nonetheless, like if the issue is the outcome, like then criticize that, and that seems like the real issue here, which is why I get uncomfortable when it's like, oh, somebody is sick. Like,
This is, by the way, an incredible storyline in The West Wing, by the way.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
right. That's right.
All right, one more question. Let's go to you over there, sir.
Last question, no pressure.
Yeah, big no pressure, man.
that's a good question.
The problem is I have something to say about pretty much everything that's been said, but I'm going to spam all your Twitter feeds for it.
Good.
I'm going to... Okay, I'm going to go with... do you think that... So somebody earlier paraphrased the newsroom, and they talked... another newsroom thing, I think one of the worst things for media has been, and it's long defunct now, but the Equal Time Act, because sometimes there's not 2 sides, there's 40, and sometimes there's not 2 sides, there's 1. And so do you think that media outlets are attempt to don't want to be called liberal media, and so therefore they push falsehood as a way of showing another side of the argument?
Is there too much false equivalence right now? You know, and I think that's a criticism that's been leveled at the New York Times, because especially recently, because we just hired Brett Stevens as a op-ed columnist. That's a criticism that gets leveled all the time on cable news. Are news organizations trying too hard to show objectivity?
If I can co-moderate, because I was actually going to ask this question earlier, which is that, do you think that the coverage of the Clinton scandals, that the email stories were followed more aggressively and scandalized more because it needed to balance out all of the scandal and negative reporting on Donald Trump?
I don't think always consciously, but I think sometimes subconsciously.
Yeah,
a lot of these things in newsrooms are not done on purpose. They're done out of habit or just accident or incompetence.
I kind of think like what happens is you have, okay, you've got 2, fine, we'll just use, this is not exact, but you've got 2 reporters who cover Donald Trump. I mean, you've got 2 reporters who cover Hillary Clinton. And it's like, what do you got, Donald Trump report? And they're like, I've got this, I got this. And then the Hillary Clinton reporter is like, oh yeah, she's got this opioid plan. That's a real snoozer. Like, oh, but look, there's another like email that came out. Like, I could write that up. And so I think there's that, and I think that's a lot of where false equivalency comes from, is actually like literally staffing in newsrooms is one thing. And then 2, I really do think that the Clinton, the long-running relationship between the media and the Clintons, and I think in Washington and New York media, that like there's a sort of cachet to getting a Clinton scoop and a Clinton dirt scoop, and that also doubly impacted it. So I did feel there was, I don't know if the phrase is false equivalency, but I could see these forces aligning in a way where a set of Clinton scandals could be presented in a way that resonated as deeply as something that was not as, a big of a deal as some of the other things that we saw happening.
Right. But it certainly is, it's a problem on coverage of climate change and other issues as well. I think the issue of false equivalency is, I think there's a lot of awareness of it now in newsrooms. It's almost, the term's almost a punchline in some ways, but there is a lot of awareness of it in a way that there wasn't, let's say 10 years ago. Let's go a little ways back. On climate change, for example, I think if you were to look at nightly news pieces and the tone of those pieces now versus 10 or 20, there's been a change in those tone. When you have a alternative media universe apparatus designed to create an alternative narrative, I'm not sure how much it matters, the tone of the nightly news pieces. But I think we've seen newsrooms try to make some efforts not to pretend like there's 2 equal sides on some of these issues. And I like the way you said it. Sometimes there's 40 sides. Sometimes there are many, many more than 2 sides. And that's one of the struggles, I think, in television newsrooms. How do you show, maybe you put up 40 boxes of 40 different talking heads. How do you show this? But that's a real issue.
Well, with that, we want to thank you sincerely for coming out tonight. We hope we sounded kind of smart.